Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program today, Man's Best Friend, Dogs in the Ancient World. We're delighted to welcome back our presenter, Ellen Green, who's joining us from London. The library is grateful to the Friends of the Glencoe Public Library for supporting this Visiting Professors event. Now let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. After working as a field archaeologist in London for 5 years, Ellen Green returned to academia. She is currently working on a PhD at the University of Reading. She specializes in bioarchaeology with the focus on ancient burial practices during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods in England. Much of her research is finding and examining human remains found in odd places. This is her 6th program for us, and it's been a pleasure not only to learn about archaeology, but also to see her fascinating career unfold. Ellen, it's really nice to have you here again. Please go ahead.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Grace. I'm very excited to be talking to you about dogs tonight. When I first suggested this program, people were a bit confused because dogs are not usually what I talk about. Despite being an avid dog lover in real life. But as Grace said, my research looks at human and animal remains in weird places. And one of my sites, I started to notice something strange, which was that the majority of my bones were dog bones. In fact, I got 128 dogs out of a single pit that had been in use for only 30 years. And that got me thinking about the role of dogs in Roman Britain, which got me thinking about the role of dogs in the Roman world. And I just ended up going down this complete and utter rabbit hole about dogs. And I'm really excited to share all of it with you because it's actually really interesting. And I think says a lot about human-animal interactions in the past. So without further ado, let's get started. So there we go. I think it's really important whenever you're talking about any sort of study of the past to look at what sort of evidence you're looking at and what that can tell you, because dogs obviously aren't sitting there writing about themselves. People do write about dogs, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about I've gotten from historical sources, either ancient authors writing about the practicalities of owning dogs, or tomb inscriptions, gravestone inscriptions, or things like poetry and mythology, but that's not the only way we can find things out. So the most obvious is perhaps iconography, objects and art that show dogs, like this Romano-British brooch showing a dog hunting a boar. This can tell you a lot, not only about what dogs may have looked like in the past, although obviously this is quite stylized, but also sort of what roles they played and how people regarded them. Hunting dogs in Britain were quite prized. Strabo tells us that, in fact, Great Britain's hunting dogs were some of the best in the Roman world. It was one of their main exports. And you can see, you know, the sort of role that dogs played in elite society here. But that's not the only evidence we have. So this is actually probably one of my favorite artifacts I'll show you tonight. This is a tile from Roman Silchester with some footprints on it. And much like today when you see dog paw prints in concrete, they're not really meant to be there, and that's part of their charm. So what these tell us really is not only that dogs were present in Roman Silchester, which was a thriving, community, but also that they probably weren't on leashes. There were probably some free-reigning dogs, because the way these tiles, they're called tegula, were made was generally in the summer. They would be pressed into molds and then left out to dry in the sun. And animals would occasionally walk over them. Again, this is not an intentional process. I'm sure the potter was not terribly happy about it. But dog prints actually make up around 75% of the identifiable paw prints on tiles recovered from Silchester, which is a lot of tiles and a lot of dogs. So not only are they there, but we know that they're part of the everyday fabric of the town and that they're not just existing in this sort of space as people's beloved pets and houses. They're also free roaming dogs in the township. And then the last really good source of information, and I am of course incredibly biased about this being a bioarch, is dog skeletons. So this particular skeleton is also from Silchester, but it's a little bit older than the tiles. It's from the Iron Age. And the really interesting thing about this dog is how tiny it is. So this dog would have only been about 29 centimeters high at the shoulder. Small dogs were not a thing in Iron Age Britain. This is one of very, very few examples we have, despite having quite a lot of dog skeletons from the time period. And it's evidence for trade, really, with the Roman world, because the Romans had lapdogs and were very fond of them. And in fact, when they conquer Britain, lapdogs start to become a thing here too, which I will talk about more in a bit. But during the Iron Age, they were pretty much unheard of. So this shows dogs acting, as prestige items and as trade items, but, also as very valued pets and exotica. The other thing dog skeletons can tell us about is also health and diet. So again, I'll talk about this a bit more later in the presentation, but in my sample, I have loads of examples of dogs with dental problems, missing teeth, and what's called calculus, which is a buildup of plaque, as well as really quite bad arthritis. This indicates that these dogs were being taken care of. The dogs with calculus, the dental plaque, that means they're being given a soft diet. People are probably preparing food for these animals. They're not just being left to fend for themselves. They're living to an old age and they're being looked after even after they can't be working animals. So there's definitely evidence that people cared about dogs in the past that you can see looking at their skeletons. Which brings me on to exactly how long have dogs and humans been working together. So this little watercolor is off one of the cave paintings in France. There are some theories that it shows a very early dog. It's difficult to tell, however, whether it's a dog or a wolf. And this is actually one of the problems with archaeology looking into this question, why I've got an earliest proposed and an earliest confirmed date there for you, is that it's actually really hard morphologically to tell the difference between early dogs and wolves, especially because often we don't have complete skeletons. So there have been some genetic studies, actually a very interesting one just came out a couple of weeks ago that looked at different lineages in modern dogs and tried to trace them back. And it found actually that dogs were probably domesticated in at least 2 different incidences in different parts of the world, which is pretty amazing. I think it really says something about the human-dog relationship that in 2 separate places, people domesticated them. People saw wolves and went, I want one of them, which is pretty fantastic. The other thing about the domestication of dogs that I don't think people generally realize is they were domesticated, even if we go with the most conservative date for when they were domesticated, a good 1,000 years before any other animal. And a lot of that probably has to do with their role as hunters and as animals that can help humans with hunting, because they're domesticated before agriculture. So this rock art, which is from Saudi Arabia, it's about 7th, 8th millennium BC. It's notably, again, before agriculture and before pastoralism, is the earliest depiction of leashes, which is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it shows humans having control over the dogs, and those are definitely domestic dogs helping on the hunt, but also not all of the dogs are leashed. This is interesting. It kind of indicates that the dogs might have different roles in the hunt, which again makes sense. One of the reasons that dogs have been so successful as domestic animals and are so beloved even in the modern day is how versatile they are. Dogs are smart and they can be trained to do different things. So this does sort of hint at maybe there being several different classes, I say classes, several different jobs that dogs did in the past. But I don't want you to think that dogs in the past, even in the very, very early past, only existed as working animals and as a practical method of humans to interact with nature. There's evidence that people loved their dogs and that they were still acting as companions. And some of the best evidence for this is actually this jawbone. So this is from the Bonn Oberkassel dog, which is actually one of the earliest confirmed dogs we have. It's a 27 to 28-week-old puppy. So the poor dog was not very old when it died, and it was found in a burial of 2 adult humans, and it was covered in the same red pigment as the human skeletons. It was a very deliberate inclusion in the burial. And I think we can probably say that these people loved their dog. And I say that mainly because of this. So this is the canine. And see these bands? That's something called enamel hyperplasia. Enamel hyperplasia happens when your body undergoes stress when your teeth are forming, and you can find it in any mammals. In fact, it's a very common thing to look at in human skeletons. This dog was very, very sick while its teeth was forming in 3 separate incidences. So scientists think that it probably had canine distemper. And the thing about canine distemper is it's very disabling, it's very fast, and it's very lethal. But this dog survived at least 3 bouts of it before it died. So this dog must have been being looked after, and there's no way it was being used as a hunting dog or as a working dog during this time period, because canine distemper, like I said, is quite disabling. And also, a 27 to 28-week-old puppy is not going to be the most useful hunting dog. People clearly took care of it during its bouts of illness and allowed it to survive at least several. It's always an interesting discussion, though, what people call their dogs, because I think that can be quite revealing in how people think about them. And we might not have this data for prehistoric periods like our Bonn Oberkassel dog, but we certainly have it for all the societies that had writing, or many of them anyway. So in the 4th century BC, Xenophon wrote a whole book on the breeding, raising, and training of hunting dogs. And he very proudly states that you should give hounds short names so as to be able to call them easily. And these are some of the names he lists in his book as good dog names. And you'll see, actually, both the Greek and the Roman ones are not necessarily names that would be out of place today. You know, I've definitely met dogs called Sky. I don't think anybody would look twice if you called your dog Butcher or Sunbeam. The Romans thought very similarly. Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella in the 1st century AD said that dogs should be called by names which are not very long, so that each may obey more quickly when called. But he also adds, but they should not have shorter names than those which are pronounced with 2 syllables. So he warns about naming them with things that are too quick to say, although he doesn't give a reason why. Again, I've listed some of the names he suggests, although I will note Her Little Ladyship is actually a name I got from a poem Marshall wrote, which I will read to you later, which is quite entertaining, because again, you can really see that being used as a name today. Spot is another one that always seems timeless. In fact, Cerberus translates to spot, which is quite interesting. So the Roman and Greek names I got from primarily either manuals on agriculture or from mythology and poetry. But the Egyptian ones I got from a slightly different source. So the Egyptian ones I got from engraved collars, which we found a couple of. And they seem, again, to be very focused on traits they want the dog to have. So brave one, good herdsman. I will note that I did find one example of a dog called Useless, which I really hope is an ironic name. It did make me laugh when I found it. We don't, unfortunately, have any more information about Useless other than the poor dog's name. The Egyptians also sometimes just gave dogs numbers, the 1st, the 2nd, the 5th. Presumably these were working animals rather than pets. Dogs that are working are often treated very differently than dogs which are considered companions, both in modern culture and in the ancient world. Now, the Mesopotamian names are a little bit different, and not only because they're kind of a mouthful to say, but whereas all the other names I've listed from different societies probably were used as dog names, the Mesopotamian ones actually come from little figurines that were buried at under doorways and at thresholds as a protective charm. Now, we don't actually know what people in Mesopotamia would have called their actual living dogs. We don't have any records of this. So it's very possible they used the same names that they did for these charms, where the dogs are referred to as things like Catcher of Hostile One or Consume His Life. But we don't know. I do quite like the name Introducer of Beneficent Ones, though. I think I might steal that if I ever get a dog, Benny for short. It's quite a nice idea. So dogs were first sort of domesticated probably as hunting partners. Dogs are pack hunters, they're social, they're intelligent, they're actually a really good fit for how human societies operate. But as human societies evolved and developed, hunting dogs probably became more of a prestige item. Certainly, there has been a lot of ink spent writing about dog breeds over the years, again, starting in the ancient world and which are best for what, and talking about bloodlines and fine hunting hounds. And all of the pictures I have here are prestige, from prestige places, and are very, very fancy items showing dogs hunting and their importance in these high society hunts as a social statement. So this is from the tomb of an Egyptian official. This is a Roman mosaic. This is from a tomb in Greece and is a fresco. This is a very famous beaker from Roman Britain, absolutely gorgeous greyhound-like type dog there. And this is from one of the lion hunt reliefs from Assyria that was found in the Nimrud Palace. So you can see dogs are often portrayed sort of alongside people at the top of society, especially in this sort of hunting role. Just a note also on collars, you'll note that all of these dogs have collars. Now, there's an interesting distinction made in the ancient world between collared dogs, which are people's prize possessions, and stray dogs, which are often not treated nearly as well. And there does seem to be this sort of dual treatment, which is quite interesting. Roman collars in particular on hunting dogs and guard dogs are interesting because they tended to be studded, much like the sort of stereotypical guard dog collars you see today, but the reason was different. So Roman writers write that the reason you should collar your dog like this is so that if a wolf attacks it, it will be protected, and the wolf will learn that biting a dog is a really bad idea, which is interesting. I don't know how well it works. So after hunting, I think it's pretty fair to say one of the main roles of dogs is guarding and functioning as guard dogs. And again, this sort of translates today. And it's very interesting, certainly, that the things that are very consistent when looking at how dogs are viewed in the ancient world is the traits of loyalty and being good judges of character and being protective are the ones that really seem to run throughout pretty much every ancient society I looked at. So these frescoes are all from Pompeii. They meet with the Roman advice that when you start a farm, you should get 2 guard dogs, one white so you can see it at night and distinguish it from wolves, and one black because it's much more intimidating to thieves during the day. And the Romans were very, very big on guard dogs. Virgil writes about their virtues. It pops up in quite a lot of their writing. It's one of the first things you're advised to do if you ever get a farm, like I said. Now, Pompeii was a city, not a farm, but they certainly seem to have employed guard dogs here. There are several mosaics depicting them, usually in the sort of atrium, so the entryway of the house. Most of the dogs are black. Almost all of them have these collars, again, with the studs, and are shown chained in the atrium. Now, there's some theories that this acted almost like an ancient, this house is protected by black security. It was warning people that the house was protected by a guard dog. In fact, Kawe Kanem literally translates to beware the dog. But we know that these houses did actually have dogs as well, because we found some of them. So this poor guy died when Vesuvius erupted. But you can see that he's got the collar, and he was found chained in the atrium of one of the houses. But it's not just physical threats that dogs were meant to guard against. In a lot of cultures, there's this connection between dogs and guarding against the supernatural. So these are the dogs from Nineveh. They were found on the threshold of the palace, well, under the threshold of the palace where they had been buried. They're each inscribed with their name, which I've got written down the side here. And the names, I think, give you an idea of the dog's purpose, particularly Expeller of Evil and Don't Think Bite. These dogs weren't only inscribed with the names, though. They were also inscribed with ritual texts that were meant to bring them to life and allow them to guard the palace from both physical and supernatural threats. The idea was that nothing evil, be it a person or a ghost or a demon, could cross the threshold without the dogs fighting it. So you can see sort of the role that they played in the ancient world as this idea of bulwarks against all kinds of threats. And the perceptiveness of dogs and their loyalty and tenaciousness, really, in guarding is very much noted. So in Greek mythology, there are two dogs I want to talk about in particular. So the first is Cerberus, who is the guardian of the underworld. Now, Cerberus, his main job was to keep the dead in the land of the dead and the living in the land of the living. And it was one of Hercules' 12 impossible labors to go and steal him. Cerberus very much is, again, viewed as that guardian of the threshold point and, somebody who's distinguishing between the dead and the living. This is Argos. This relief shows Odysseus. Now, if you've read the Odyssey, you know Odysseus wandered for 20 years and then came home to Ithaca disguised as a beggar. While he was away, suitors took over his house, ate all his food, spent a long time trying to get with his wife. Not great. And Argos, when Odysseus left, was Odysseus's favorite hunting dog and is described as a very noble beast. When he comes back, Argos has been thrown out into the yard and not taken care of. And Argos is the only one, including Odysseus's own son, to recognize Odysseus when he's in disguise. When Odysseus comes in, it's Argos that recognizes him and comes up to him, having held on for 20 years, waiting for his master. Now, Odysseus can't acknowledge Argos because his disguise will be ruined, but he sheds a single tear. And Argos, so happy his master has returned, dies sort of on the spot now that he has seen Odysseus again. And there's really this emphasis that Argos is the only one that can see through the disguise, and this idea that dogs are really excellent judges of character. Now, I debated a lot actually about putting this slide in, but I think it's worth addressing. If you've seen Julius Caesar, you know the phrase, "let's slip the dogs of war." I found numerous classical references when I was researching to this idea that the Greeks and Romans did use dogs in warfare, particularly Molossians and Cane Corso, which are Italian breeds that are sort of Mastiff-like, like this Scully. I found a couple sources mentioning strapping baskets of Greek fire on them and sending them out to disrupt enemy cavalry. I found a couple of sources talking about putting them in armor and just releasing them as troops. I didn't find any archaeological evidence to back any of this up, I'm afraid, hence why we have this adorable little dachshund in chainmail rather than an actual ancient depiction. There are scattered references of dogs being used in warfare, but not necessarily of dogs being trained specifically for warfare in the ancient world. Most of the references I found are not contemporary with the events they're writing about. Quite a lot of the sources I found, particularly about the Molossan and Cane Corso, come from the breed registration websites themselves and don't necessarily have citation. I couldn't find the ancient passages they were referring to. The most sort of reputable one I found was a reference to dogs being used as messengers, but even in that case, it was a Roman example. It wasn't that the dogs had been trained as messengers so much as a dog was used as a messenger to go back to its master, because they had this idea that dogs were very loyal to their masters, and according to the classical source, it worked. Much more common and actually archaeologically viable is the idea of dogs as healers, which makes sense. Dogs in the modern world, we know that they're quite effective in a lot of ways for healing. We have therapy dogs, we have guide dogs, we have dogs that can sniff out cancer, we have dogs that can warn of seizures. And just from a personal standpoint, I know I always feel better when I've been around dogs. I'm not sure I agree with some of the other ancient advice. Pliny the Elder was very convinced that you could fix dislocation by rubbing the joint with a plant a dog peed on. I think I might skip that one. But I found a lot of sources that talked about holding puppies as a way of helping. And actually the most common one, which I found Roman, Greek, Hittite, Romano-British examples of, was this idea of having puppies lick a sick person, or it wasn't always puppies, but having dogs lick a sick person, and that helping to cure wounds, which is quite interesting. In fact, we have records from the sanctuary of Asclepios in Greece, where they kept sacred dogs. Dogs were considered sacred to Asclepios, who was a god of healing. That a boy was cured of his blindness after being licked by the sacred dog, which is quite a nice idea. But it's really quite prevalent in quite a lot of the world. So these are statues from the sanctuary of Nodens, found in Wales. And you'll see that they both really emphasize the fact that the dog is licking. It's, especially with this guy over here, the main thing that they've emphasized. And it's because there's this idea that dogs, when they lick themselves, it helps heal the wounds. So why not try it on people? And it has been interesting because modern studies have shown that dog saliva does help protect against certain types of infection. I still wouldn't advise it as a methodology of protecting yourself from infection, but it is interesting that there was some merit to it. Dogs are also very associated with the god Nehelina, who is a Romano-Germanic goddess, again, of healing. But more generally, there's an association between dogs and mother goddesses and fertility goddesses, sort of in the Roman world, which is quite interesting. You can see Nehelina is depicted here with a dog on one side and a bushel of apples on the other. But it's not only Europe, and it predates the Romans in a lot of parts of the world. So the Gulia and Ninisina are both Mesopotamian goddesses that are associated both with healing and with dogs. So this is Gulia here in these two seal impressions. In later periods of Mesopotamian history, she is just depicted as a dog rather than a woman with a dog. And then this dog is a carved soapstone effigy that was dedicated to Ninisina. Ninisina is interesting because her temples were actually called the dog house. And they were temples of healing. She was known as the great physician. And actually this dog was dedicated by a physician to Ninisina to ask for aid healing a king or helping the king's health. And you can see it's quite a sympathetic looking dog. It really does just look like somebody's pet. It's quite non-threatening. I would definitely pet that dog if it was real. But the fact that Ninisina's temples not only had statues of dogs dedicated to them, but also we found dog bones when they've been excavated. Interestingly, some of the dog bones have shown signs of disease. There is a theory that this might be because they were being healed at the temple. There isn't a huge amount of evidence for that, but it is a really interesting idea. The other really big association that seems to run through quite a lot of different mythologies is the idea of dogs in the underworld. And a lot of this spans from the idea of dogs as guides. So from a living perspective, dogs were often considered very helpful animals. And in the 2nd century AD, 1,000 sacred hounds were apparently kept at a temple dedicated to Adrianus, who was a god in Sicily. And their main purpose, according to texts, was to fawn over visitors by day and lead intoxicated pilgrims home at night, which I quite like. Again, the idea of these very early guide dogs helping drunk people home. But it runs deeper than that. And there is this big connection between dogs and the underworld, particularly as psychopomps, so spirits that are helping guide the dead, the living, into the land of the dead when they die and helping them cross this threshold. but also as guardians. So you've got Cerberus down here, again, guarding the underworld. This is a depiction of the Roman goddess Hecate. She is a goddess of magic, very associated with the underworld and always depicted with dogs. And to go with the guarding aspect, there was this idea that dogs could sense Hecate. So if your dog was barking at nothing, it might be warning of her approach, or it might be warning of ghosts, which is quite, again, a sort of interesting idea that they have this perception. But even in pre-classical societies, we do seem to get this connection between dogs and the underworld. So this is a Bronze Age skeleton from Germany, from the Beaker people. And that bundle it's holding is made up of canines from over 50 dogs, and seashells, and swaddled in it, which you can't see, is an infant. So there's this idea that this may have been a protective thing, to help protect the infant in the afterlife. And we'll see again that that idea does come up more than once. So the Persians really loved dogs. Pre-Islamic Iran, dogs were a really, really big deal, to the point where how you treated your dogs in life kind of determined whether or not you had a good afterlife. This is a quote from one of the holy texts. And there was this idea that dogs guarded the Chinvat Bridge, which spans the abyss between the lands of the living and the dead. And there were 2 dogs there. And they would judge if you were worthy of going into the afterlife or not. And if you treated dogs badly, you were kind of out of luck. So it was very, very important to them how you treated dogs. And dogs were said to be part divine. And again, there's this idea of dogs as these creatures that are sort of part animal, part human, and part divine, and really spanning the bridge between the human and animal worlds. A really interesting thing about Persian death rituals, again, at the time, though, is that when somebody died, what you had to do was lead a dog to look at the body. And particularly favored for this was dogs with eye spots. This is called the Sangdeed. Apologies for my pronunciation. And sort of the purpose was twofold. So it was to confirm the person was dead, but again, it was to protect them from ghosts. It was to scare off any malignant spirits. This isn't only an old world phenomenon, though. Even in the new world, where dogs were, to some extent, seen as a food source, they play a really, really important role in people's afterlives. So in the classical Maya period, dogs are really frequently found in graves. And there's this idea that dogs guided the departed on their journey to the underworld. And this idea of dogs as guides is, again, very, very strong in Maya mythology. They're often depicted carrying torches, and that's because in Maya mythology, there's this idea that dogs brought fire to people. So you can really see, again, this idea of them as helping humans along and their integral role. This isn't only the Maya, the Aztecs got in on this too. So these 2 depictions are of the Aztec god Zuatl. Zuatl was the canine companion of the sun, a strong connection to the underworld, if not a true underworld god. And the interesting thing about Zuatl is that there's a story that in the 5th age, there were no humans at the beginning. They had been wiped out in an earlier age, and Zuatl went down to the underworld, stole the bones of humans, brought them back up to the world, and bled on them to bring humans to life. Now, in Aztec society, again, dogs were very commonly eaten, but they still had this very, very important role as, you know, almost creators in a sense. It's also worth noting that in Aztec mythology, when you died, you had to wander the underworld, and one of the places you had to go was a river, and the shore was called the Place of Dogs. And the idea was that the spirits of dogs would be on this shore. And if you had a dog in life, the dog would, you treated it well, the dog would come and help you across the river. Now, similar myths occur in a lot of Mesoamerican societies of dogs helping their owners cross this sort of liminal river boundary into the underworld. Theories have to do with the idea that dogs are quite good swimmers, and people may have observed this, but it is an interesting sort of motif. And then in Roman Britain, we still get this idea of dogs as these sort of protecting spirits after death. So there aren't many textual sources that talk about this, but there is a big association archaeologically between infant skeletons and dogs in Roman cemeteries. Well, not only in cemeteries, but anywhere really you get burials. So this is a dog from a cemetery on Lant Street in London. It was found with an infant cremation. And really interestingly, the dog had been buried with this absolutely gorgeous collar. It got glass beads and beautiful copper bits. It's an absolutely gorgeous item, and is nicer than some of the human grave goods that were found at the cemetery, which is quite interesting. The Romans really liked dogs. In Roman Britain, dogs make up 48% of all articulated animal burials, despite only making up 10% of sort of animal assemblages generally in the time period. So articulated means they're buried whole, and the bodies have been treated with arguably some modicum of respect. And this is a much higher rate in Roman Britain than you get in Iron Age Britain. But we don't know exactly what was going on with that. And then finally, in Egypt, the association between dogs and the dead is quite strong. So Anubis was the jackal-headed god of embalming. It was his role to sort of lead the dead through the journey to the afterlife. Here you can see him leading someone, and then you can see him doing the weighing of the heart ceremony. And there's this, again, this idea of dogs as an arbiter. So he weighs the heart against feather of truth. And if you've lived a bad life and your heart is heavier than the feather of truth, it gets eaten by a demon called Ammut, and then you cease to exist. And if it isn't, then you go to the afterlife, and the Egyptian afterlife is fairly nice. So animal cults are mainly a big thing during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. And we know that dogs were associated with Anubis because at the Temple of Anubis at Saqqara, there was a massive catacomb found that had approximately 5,571 dogs in it. Now, this catacomb had been robbed in antiquity, so originally there probably would have been more. It was in use roughly from the 4th century BC to the 1st century AD. So that's a lot of dogs in a not massive time period. The really interesting thing about the dogs at Saqqara were A, the levels of mummification were not necessarily consistent. Some had been very beautifully mummified, like this example here, and some had been mummified very poorly, and some had been hadn't been mummified at all. There were some fake dogs at Saqqara, where the mummies looked like dog mummies, but when they were x-rayed, contained nothing but cloth. And there's evidence that these dogs were being bred near the temple. There must have been massive breeding operations to provide this many dogs for the offerings. And the idea was that pilgrims would go and they would buy a dog offering for Anubis, and that dog would act as a go-between and take their wishes to the god. So I just really want to finish up the presentation by talking about the arguably the most important and most enduring role of dogs in society, and that's dogs as our companions. I'm sure most of you are dog people, or you wouldn't have chosen to come to this talk. But dogs are wonderful, and we are not the first people to think that. So the Greeks and the Romans often left really quite touching epitaphs to their pets, such as the one I've got up on the screen. I actually found this super touching, especially the bit about "never again shall thou give me 1,000 kisses." Losing a pet's really hard, and it's clear that these people were really affected by it because they have put a lot of time and effort into these monuments. And I do enjoy, so not only this epitaph, but there are others that are quite fabulous. So there's one from Greece that is, I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands. We have some that have beautiful carvings of the dogs. And I just want to read to you a poem Marshall wrote actually about a dog called Her Little Ladyship, which translates in Latin to Isa, because I think you'll see in it many sentiments you might recognize. Isa is naughtier than the sparrow of Catullus. Isa is purer than the kisses of a dove. Isa is more seductive than all the girls. Isa is more precious than Indian diamonds. Isa is the darling of Publius, his tiny puppy. If she whines, you will think this girl is speaking. When she feels sadness and joy, and when she is compelled by the impulse of her bladder, not a single drop has befouled the covers, but with her sweet paw, she nudges you and from the couch forewarns you that she needs to be put down and asks to be lifted up. There's a great sense of modesty in this virtuous little puppy. Does not know love, nor do we find a mate worthy of a girl so delicate. In order that her last day not snatch her altogether, Publius portrays her in a painted picture in which you see an Isa so similar that she herself is not so similar to herself. In short, place Isa alongside her picture, and either you will think that one is real or you will think the other is painted. So this poem really speaks to this man's love for his dog, as well as describing a painting that he clearly had commissioned that obviously made an impression. And it is a gently mocking poem, I think. But you could write this about so many dog owners today. It really is timeless. And then this last slide is really where I want to talk about some of my research, in that when I started, it never really occurred to me that I would be finding toy dogs, because I always assumed that the really small breeds and the lap dogs were kind of a modern thing. You know, why would people in the ancient world be breeding dogs to be tiny and adorable? Well, it turns out the Romans were really fond of tiny, adorable dogs. And while it was very much a status symbol to have an animal that you took care of and gave resources to that wasn't working, I think it is more than that, because the site I'm looking at is from rural Surrey. It's from the middle of nowhere. And I have found evidence that they are breeding these little small dogs. So this is a leg bone from a dog that has a condition called chondrodystrophy. It is technically a medical condition, but it's not something that hurts the dog. And it is, in fact, what is responsible for making dwarf dogs. So that sort of short leg, long body look. So, you know, corgis all have it, dachshunds all have it. So I found a lot of examples of this. They're very intentionally breeding these dogs. Again, my site is not from the center of London. This isn't a high status site. But they are breeding dogs to be more adorable. And there is an absolutely huge variation in the size of dogs we're getting. So not only do I have 128 dogs, but these two bones are both adult dog jaws. This one would have been about the size of a German Shepherd, and this one would have been about the size of a Jack Russell. There's a huge variation. And even in the depictions, you know, we get things like this little Maltese. So I think it's really important to reflect on the idea that people in the ancient world did use dogs as working animals, but also clearly very much cared about them. And they operated in all kinds of spaces. And now I just want to finish really by giving you guys a challenge. So I went to the British Museum with some friends and I wanted to take pictures of the dogs. And my friend said, "Don't be silly, Ellen. There won't be any dogs in the British Museum." I found at least one in every room. So next time you go to a museum, take a look and see what you can find, because dogs have been with humans since the beginning, and they've played a very important role in our development and in multiple civilizations. And we don't really think about it, but they're there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. That was wonderful. Especially that dachshund in a chainmail coat. I can't get over that. We have lots of questions. People in the chat have been telling us how much they love the presentation. So you hit a nerve here, a very good one. Here's the first question from Alex. Was Cerberus's name likely intended as a bit of levity in the legend? Calling Cerberus Spot, was it sort of like calling Discworld's death, having a horse named Binky?
I would really love to have the answer to that question, but I'm afraid I'm not a classicist. I will need to look into it. I like to think so. Greek myths are a wonderful mix of the funny, the absurd, and the quite poignant.
Do you have any, thank you, do you have any information on when the different breeds and land races and types of dogs began to appear?
Not off the top of my head. There's been a lot of research dedicated into types and when they sort of start to appear. I know in Britain, you start only to get terriers and small dogs really after the Roman invasion. I will say that breeds is a Victorian invention. So if you're trying to research specific breeds, it's quite hard to get anything sort of pre-19th century. It was the Victorians that really codified bloodlines in that way. But types you can get, and you can to some extent tell types from skeletal information. So you can get it going quite far back.
Great, thank you. Eve wants to know, are hunting dogs ever entombed with humans, or just dogs more as pets?
Yep.
Or is it hard to tell?
I mean, it's always quite difficult to tell, but there are definitely some dogs that, if we go by sort of tomb depictions in Egypt, appear to be hunting dogs. I think Ramses II was entombed with his dogs, though I would need to double check that.
Okay, thank you. Harriet asks, I see that in many of the representations, the dogs have floppy ears. She's read that in Russian experiments to domesticate foxes, one of the signs of domestication was that their ears evolved to be floppy. Does this hold true for dogs, or again, is it difficult to tell because the floppy eared parts of dog ears didn't survive thousands of years of entombment?
I mean, we'd have to use pictorial evidence for that, but it is interesting that is an experiment that's happened, and it's not only with dogs. It has showed up with a lot of animals that they've done domestication experiments with. There does seem to be a genetic link, but it would take a geneticist, I think, to properly answer that question, which I am unfortunately not.
Right, thanks. Helena says she has a soft spot for legends like Gellert, the brave Welsh dog who died defending his master's family from a wolf. But she's read that the story was invented in the last 200 years. And are there any confirmed hero dogs from long ago?
I found one classical inscription referring to a dog that may have been at the Battle of Marathon, who killed so many enemy soldiers he was sort of like made an honorary troop. It's an excellent story. I am not sure how verifiable it is, but I quite like it as an idea. And certainly we have some of those inscriptions talk about dogs, tomb inscriptions. I found one that talked about a dog so fierce, even dead animals would fear to approach its grave, which I quite liked.
Here's another question. This may not be one that you can answer. Were dogs spayed or neutered in the ancient world?
I really don't know. I would need to look into that. My gut says that there was some population control, but not necessarily on the level that we do today.
Right, thanks. Here's one. Clive asks a question that I've always wondered about. Co-burials such as, well, he gives some examples, suggest a strong human-dog bond, but then how did the dog end up in the grave with the human? It seems in many cases the dog must have been sacrificed specifically so it could be buried with the human, which doesn't really fit with our modern idea of affection for dogs.
You have to understand how animals were conceived of and how the afterlife was conceived of in the ancient world was very, very different to how we think of it today. So all those dogs at Saqqara were absolutely sacrificed. That is without a doubt. When you look at the x-rays on the mummies, you can see how they died. The Von Obermann dog probably died of canine distemper. So that might not have been, but the Lant Street dog, again, there's definitely some ritual nonsense going on because it doesn't have its head or any of its paws, and that's not a preservation thing. You can see the cut marks on the skeleton. I think it's an idea very much that dogs have these roles that transcend life, and they don't necessarily think of sacrificing or killing them as the end, just putting them in a different position. I think there is affection in a lot of these cases, but I think it's very different to how we view affection today.
Vera has a question. She's heard about a theory that domesticating dogs gave Homo sapiens a big advantage over Neanderthals. Any thoughts on that?
I am sorry. I am a specialist very much in the classical period. I would need to research that. It's a very interesting theory. And I don't know of any Neanderthal burials that have dogs involved, but I would definitely need to look into that. But it's a brilliant question.
Kate asks if you could tell us anything more about the Bonn Oberkassel burials. And do you have more details?
I don't off the top of my head, but I did find numerous excellent articles about them, both sort of pop sci articles. I think there was one from the New York Times. Definitely National Geographic has covered it, and some excellent academic papers if you want to wade through the jargon. It's a very, very studied burial.
Somebody says, lovely presentation, thank you. I think Chinese emperors had very small dogs to keep their feet warm, which would have been useful in cold, damp Britain.
I did read some very interesting things about dogs in China. I didn't feel I had the archaeological context to really talk about it, but hot water bottle was definitely a thing listed as dogs' roles, which I quite enjoyed. Interestingly, China again has this, at least in some periods, this link between dogs and guiding people to the afterlife. I was really blown away by how commonly I found that in different cultures.
Helena wants to know, what's up with your archaeology pup's awesome booties in that picture?
So that is Amber. She helped out on the dig I most recently did, which is a Roman villa. And we were in the middle of a field in the middle of nowhere, and one of the plants had really spiky seeds that kept cutting her paws. So her owner got her some very safety conscious boots so that she could run around to her heart's content without worrying about getting cuts on her feet.
Here's another question. What would you like to ask Romano Brits about their dogs? Any questions that you would love to pose to them?
I have so many questions.
What are
so many? Starting with, why are there 128 dogs in a pit in the middle of Surrey?
Any more?
I would love to know actually more about the Romano-British healing gods that are associated with dogs. We only have a few depictions and we don't have a lot of textual evidence, and I'd love to know if that's sort of based on older ideas about dogs. There's a lot of British and Irish folk legends about dogs. I'd love to know if those sort of come from an older root. Black Shuck, who's the dog that's meant to wander the moors and warn you of impending death. They're very similar legends in a lot of Britain, and I would just love to know if those come from an Iron Age thing or if they're more modern, because nobody really knows where those myths have come from.
Thanks. Stephanie wants to know, have you come across any evidence of friendships between dogs and other species? Or
I have not, but admittedly, I also haven't been looking for it.
Right. Let me see. So many questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. Here's a question. Do visual or text source distinguish breeds or sex? As for status rules, which dogs are permitted by elites or by non-elites? And could slaves keep dogs?
That's a really good question. So yes, some sources distinguish between certain, again, not necessarily breeds, but types. For instance, Spartan hunting hounds are mentioned as being particularly good. Molessians were particularly favored as guard dogs in the Roman world. So the Romans definitely did write about different breeds and definitely had ideas about different breeds for different things. They did talk about the sex of dogs as well. The Roman author who I was reading about the naming of dogs, Lucius Eunice Moderatus Camella, actually talks about how to choose the best puppies, which again is not a method I would recommend for modern people to use, but the idea is you have a ring of fire, you put the puppies in the middle, and then the ones that the mother rescues first are the best dogs. Yeah. As for which people were allowed to own which dogs, that really depends on which period and place you're looking at. I know certainly in England, sort of in the Tudor period, greyhounds could only be owned by the upper classes, which is a very interesting thing. But I imagine the more you look into it, the more you would find similar prohibitions in certain periods.
Have you ever come across any ancient dog toys?
I have come across several bones that ancient dogs have chewed. And in fact, one of the things I have been looking at is there are a couple of cases of Iron Age human remains that look like they have been exposed to dogs for a limited amount of time, and the dogs have chewed a little bit, but not enough that it indicates they had unlimited access, which is quite interesting.
And I think we'll do one more question, and that is a breed question. Is there a modern parallel with the type of dog remains found from Iron Age Britain? What do you think about species?
The larger ones would probably be something approaching some kind of sight hound, like a greyhound or a lurcher. And that little one I showed you, the site report says was probably quite poodle-like.
Did you say poodle-like?
I did say poodle-like, yeah. That's what the site report said.
Okay. Ellen Green, thank you so much for sharing with us today. You get more interesting with every talk, and we're looking forward to having you back again. I have one more question, and that is from me. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did this summer?
So this summer, I helped excavate a Roman villa in the middle of the British countryside, which was very, very nice. It's where that picture of Amber with the trowel is from. We actually had 3 sight dogs, which improved the excavation hugely, I feel. The dig was on land owned by the Duke of Queensberry. It was a pretty spectacular site. We found some absolutely astounding mosaics, but it's still very much in its early days, so.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Keep up the wonderful work. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to Ellen, and thank you all for participating today. Bye.